The conclusion of the Second World War for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers was not a decisive military moment, but a sudden, jarring, and often disorienting cultural transition. They were abruptly shifted from the muddy, starving trenches of the disintegrating Reich to the surprisingly modern, comfortable, and materially abundant reality of American prisoner of war camps, many located deep within the United States. For these men, many of whom had been raised entirely under a regime obsessed with ethnic purity, martial austerity, and the fight for bare survival, the shock of encountering the American way of life, symbolized by simple things like Coca-Cola, fresh white bread, and the inexplicable complexity of baseball, was arguably as profound as the military defeat itself. The POW camp became an unintentional, prolonged, and forced laboratory, offering an unfiltered introduction to the sheer, overwhelming economic and logistical power of the nation that had crushed them. The final journey for the captured German soldier, whether yielding in the hedgerows of Normandy, surrendering en masse during the chaos of the Rhine crossings, or being rounded up in the final pocket battles, was a translation from a world defined by total, systemic scarcity to one of bewildering plenty. In the final years of the war, the German war economy was a crumbling facade, its army sustained by an infrastructure savaged by Allied bombing and a draconian, centralized command focused only on frontline expenditure. Rationing was not merely restrictive, it was a matter of survival, with calorie counts falling below 1,500 per day for combat troops, leading to chronic nutritional deficits and exhaustion. The late-war German soldiers' diet was a culinary testament to desperation, meager K rations containing rock-hard biscuits, minimal synthetic cured meats, and, notoriously, endless preparations of turnip, potato mash, and stale, dark ersatz, substitute, rye bread. Coffee was brewed from roasted acorns or chicory, fats were often hydrogenated synthetics derived from coal. Upon capture, the first shock was often visceral, the mere quality, quantity, and preparation of the food. American rations, whether C rations on the front line or standard mess hall meals in the rear, were meticulously designed for maximum protein, caloric content, and efficiency. Initial processing centers provided hot meals that contained real meat, often succulent beef or pork, items virtually unknown in late-war Germany, real sugar, and the most emotionally charged item, fresh white bread. This was bread made with precious, scarce wheat flour and butterfat, a type of consumer luxury most German civilians and soldiers had not seen since the war's early years. German veterans, who had been indoctrinated to view American society as soft, lazy, and materially decadent, were confronted with an undeniable, immediate truth: the logistical infrastructure of the enemy was utterly boundless. Accounts confirm the emotional impact was devastating. Veterans recalled the shock of seeing untouched food waste, a concept antithetical to years of German austerity. Another POW reportedly wept openly while eating his first slice of fresh white bread, realizing in that single, sweet bite the depth of Germany's failure to sustain its own forces, let alone fight a global conflict. The monochromatic world of their wartime experience was replaced by a kaleidoscopic rush of surplus. The most iconic and psychologically potent symbols of this material chasm were the American staples treated as non-negotiable luxuries in the camps: ice cream and Coca-Cola. These were more than just consumables, they represented a level of industrial and consumer surplus that directly refuted the entire Nazi narrative of a world-conquering, self-sufficient German war machine, autarky. In Nazi Germany, ice cream, especially the creamy, high-fat variety, was categorized as a wasteful, frivolous luxury. Its production was curtailed almost entirely to conserve vital dairy fat for military and essential civilian use. Its availability in American camps, often served by the scoop as a standard dessert or easily accessible at the canteen, was entirely revolutionary to the German youth. The concept of a frozen, sugary dairy product, produced effortlessly in massive quantities and distributed globally via a military supply chain, became a profound symbol of the enemy's economic abundance, something utterly unnecessary to survival, yet available freely. This availability illustrated the sheer, overwhelming, and seemingly infinite power of the American industrial economy. The case of Coca-Cola carried specific political and symbolic weight. While Coca-Cola had operated in Germany before the war, the conflict cut off the crucial syrup supply. Rather than shut down, the German bottling plant continued operations by inventing and producing Fanta, from fruit pulp and whey, deliberately positioning it as a patriotic German drink. The POWs were familiar with the idea of cola, but the return of the genuine, globally recognized American product, sold, cold, and ubiquitous, underscored their new reality. Coca-Cola, with its bright branding and multinational reach, was the antithesis of the austere, racially defined Nazi ideology. It was a visible, palatable manifestation of the economic and cultural force that had crushed the Reich. The effortless supply of this global brand proved that the self-sufficiency promised by Hitler was a lie. The operation of the camp canteen, or post-exchange, PX, became a daily source of profound cultural awakening, acting as an unintended laboratory for American capitalism. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were mandated to be paid for labor. Though the wages were small, often around 10 cents per hour for essential tasks like agricultural work or camp maintenance, the purchasing power this provided was immense and deeply foreign to their experience. Prisoners could use their wages to purchase goods that were simply unimaginable back home: high-quality American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, Camels, chocolate bars, fine soap, good shaving cream, and, critically, uncensored American magazines and paperback books. The experience was a direct contradiction of the command economy, the black markets, and the perpetual state control that had defined wartime Germany. The cleanliness, the organized inventory, the reliable supply chain, and the simple act of free purchasing and consumer choice served as the most effective piece of anti-Nazi propaganda the Allies never explicitly designed. It was a daily, material demonstration that the democratic capitalist system could fight and win a global war and simultaneously afford to supply its prisoners with a massive inventory of consumer amenities. The German economy had exhausted itself focusing every available resource on its collapsing war machine. The American economy did both effortlessly. For many soldiers, their Nazi indoctrination began to visibly crumble, replaced by a silent awe for the economic engine that had achieved this feat. Beyond the material comforts, German POWs were equally stunned by the institutional fairness and the conspicuous lack of arbitrary brutality in the American camp system. Many expected harsh retribution, arbitrary violence, or the psychological torment that characterized the conduct of their own forces, particularly on the Eastern Front, where German military discipline often involved summary executions for minor infractions or desertion. Instead, they found a system strictly governed by the Geneva Convention. American camp commandants, while strict, operated within defined, legal boundaries. The prisoners had access to camp spokesmen, Lagerführer, who were often senior German officers elected by the prisoners, who could petition the command regarding conditions. The concept of due process and the absence of immediate, political violence were entirely foreign to soldiers who had served under a totalitarian regime where justice was often arbitrary, swift, and lethal. The presence of international bodies like the YMCA further ensured adherence to humane standards and provided educational supplies. This systemic stability provided a profound psychological relief. The predictability and basic decency of their captors allowed many soldiers to begin processing their military defeat in an environment that felt physically and psychologically safe for the first time in years. They realized that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of treating them as human beings, not just as expendable military assets. This stark contrast between the Wehrmacht's often capricious discipline and the rule-bound, bureaucratic American system sowed deep, irreparable doubts about the moral and social order of the Nazi state. Life in the American camps quickly transformed into a powerful, accidental course in American culture and democracy. To fill the long hours, structured recreational activities were organized. Baseball, a game entirely alien to Europe, became an important camp sport, a perfect metaphor for American civil life, highly structured, intensely competitive, yet governed by absolute, universally respected rules and fair play. This system of competitive rules without violence offered a clear, tangible counterpoint to the totalitarian worldview that championed force over law. Furthermore, the U.S. Army launched systematic re-education programs designed to cultivate politically salvageable leadership among the younger, less indoctrinated POWs. These programs included mandatory screenings of uncensored films showing the concentration camps, lectures on Western philosophy, and the distribution of specially created anti-Nazi literature. Camps were often segregated into two groups: the hardcore Nazi camps and convert camps for those deemed ready for democratic ideals. The most famous literary output was the German-language newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, edited by cooperative POWs. The educational programs were effective not through coercion, but because the material, the facts of the atrocities and the ideals of democracy, was constantly reinforced by the soldiers' daily environment, the fairness of the MPs, the rule of the Geneva Convention, and the sheer economic comfort. This dual approach worked. The historical facts broke the ideological spell, while the material reality validated the American system. The POW camp became a critical psychological bridge for thousands of young Germans. They entered as indoctrinated soldiers and left, years later, as witnesses to the overwhelming power and abundance of the democratic capitalist system that had defeated them. The simple, sweet taste of ice cream, the ubiquitous availability of Coca-Cola, and the fairness of a baseball game were small, indelible symbols of the fundamental, unbridgeable economic and ideological gap that had ultimately determined the outcome of World War II.